The idea to investigate Méliès struck me during a late-night research session 3 weeks ago. I stumbled across an obscure forum post that described a town in southern Illinois that had mysteriously disappeared overnight in the mid-1980s, with no explanation ever given. I'd been searching for a unique destination for our next expedition, and this seemed ideal, a forgotten place wrapped in a genuine mystery. Convincing the rest of the team took some effort. Dennis was immediately on board. He was always eager for anything that promised compelling content for his urban exploration channel. Rebecca, who focused on historical documentation, was intrigued by the sparse but fascinating records, which were enough to draw her in. Victor, the newest member of our exploration group, needed no convincing at all. His passion for abandoned places was almost obsessive. We set out from Chicago just as the first light of dawn began to brighten the eastern horizon. Dennis's SUV was loaded with camping gear, camera equipment, and enough supplies to sustain us for a 4-day expedition. The early morning traffic faded as we traveled south, replaced by sprawling farmland and, eventually, the thick woodlands of southern Illinois. GPS says we're still 3 hours away, Dennis announced as we stopped for gas near Carbondale, our last reliable refueling spot before venturing into more isolated territory. Rebecca unfolded a paper map on the hood of the SUV, pointing out alternate routes she'd marked in case the main road became impassable. From what I found in the archives, she explained, tracing her finger along penciled lines, Méliès was deliberately erased from state maps after 1985. I watched Victor stock up on snacks from the gas station convenience store and added, "That's what makes this so perfect, a whole town that officially doesn't exist anymore." The first 2 hours after our stop followed the familiar pattern of our exploration trips. Interstates giving way to state highways, then to county roads with steadily decreasing traffic. We drove through tiny towns, each smaller than the last, their populations barely reaching the hundreds. The landscape gradually shifted as pine trees closed in on both sides of the increasingly narrow road. The asphalt, once smooth, turned patchy and cracked, eventually becoming more pothole than pavement. "GPS is starting to glitch," Dennis muttered, tapping his phone on the dashboard. The blue dot marking our location jumped erratically, sometimes placing us miles from any road. "That's why we brought paper maps," Rebecca said from the back seat, already consulting hers. "Take the next right. It should be about half a mile ahead." The right turn brought us onto an unmarked path, little more than a gap between the trees that could barely be called a road. The SUV's suspension groaned as we maneuvered around deep ruts and holes. About 20 minutes after turning, I spotted the first abandoned carafated blue Chevrolet, likely from the early 2000s, partially obscured by overgrown vegetation about 15 feet from the roadside. Most people would have overlooked it, but years of urban exploration had honed my ability to spot the forgotten and hidden. "Pull over," I told Dennis. He eased the SUV to the side of the dirt path. The Chevy had been stripped bare, no seats, no steering wheel, nothing left in the engine compartment. Vines had grown through the empty window frames, and rust coated most of the body panels. "This is strange," I said, examining the area around the car. "No signs of an accident. It's like someone parked it here and just walked away." Victor called out from a few yards away, "Look at this." He pointed to a circular symbol with radiating lines, like a stylized sun, carved into a nearby tree trunk. "There's another one over there," he added. Sure enough, the same symbol was etched into another tree about 20 feet away. Upon closer inspection, I noticed more of them on surrounding trees, forming a rough perimeter around the abandoned car. "Probably just kids messing around," Dennis said, already back in the SUV. "We're losing daylight." As we pressed on, I counted 3 more abandoned vehicles over the next hour, each stripped clean like the first, with nearby trees bearing the same strange symbols. Victor grew quieter with each discovery, his earlier enthusiasm visibly waning. "You okay?" I asked, as we jolted along what had become little more than a game trail. "Yeah," he replied, though his eyes remained fixed on the dense forest outside his window. "Just getting a weird feeling about this place." Rebecca, meanwhile, continued documenting our journey, snapping photos of landmarks and updating our route on the paper map. "Cell service dropped about 40 minutes ago," she announced, checking her phone. "We're officially off the grid." By mid-afternoon, even Dennis's GPS had given up, its screen displaying a blank map with our position marker floating in digital nothingness. We were now relying entirely on Rebecca's paper map and my sense of direction. The path narrowed further, branches scraping against both sides of the SUV simultaneously. Then we came across a massive pine tree lying across our route, blocking the way. "End of the road?" Dennis asked, stopping the vehicle. I stepped out to inspect the obstacle. "No, look," I said, pointing to the dirt around the trunk. "It's been moved. See these drag marks? Someone pulled it just far enough aside to let a vehicle through, then pushed it back." There was indeed a narrow gap, just wide enough for the SUV if we were careful. What struck me as odd was the precision of it. The tree hadn't fallen naturally or been cut by accident. It seemed deliberately placed, then carefully adjusted to control access. "Someone doesn't want visitors," Rebecca noted as she helped me check the clearance. "Or they don't want people leaving," Victor added quietly. We managed to squeeze the SUV through the gap and continued on. The sunlight filtering through the branches had taken on the golden hue of late afternoon, with shadows stretching across our path. According to Rebecca's calculations, Melier was still at least 2 hours away, meaning we'd arrive near sunset. "We might need to make camp before we reach town," I said, watching the light fade. "Exploring in the dark isn't ideal, especially in a place this remote." Dennis nodded in agreement, but kept driving, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The forest grew denser on either side, making the path harder to discern among the greenery. Every mile took us deeper into the middle of nowhere, further from civilization and closer to a town that, officially, no longer existed. The dirt path widened as we rounded a bend, and suddenly, the edge of Melier came into view. The fading light of dusk made the old buildings seem to materialize out of nowhere. "There it is," I said, a mix of relief and anticipation in my voice. We'd made it just as the sun prepared to dip below the tree line. Dennis slowed the SUV to a crawl as we approached a faded welcome sign. I stepped out before we fully stopped, drawn to this first tangible proof of the town's existence. The wooden sign had seen better days, its paint peeling and colors bleached by decades of exposure. "Welcome to Melier, a community with heart," was barely legible beneath layers of grime and weather damage. Population figures had once been painted below, but time had erased all but a faint trace of the numbers. "Looks like we won't need to camp outside town after all," I called back to the others, who were gathering equipment from the vehicle. Dennis already had his camera out, filming our approach and the sign. "This is perfect," he said, pivoting to capture the view down Main Street. "It's like a movie set." He wasn't wrong. Main Street stretched before us in surreal preservation, not pristine, but eerily intact for a place abandoned nearly 40 years ago. The golden light of sunset illuminated a perfectly arranged small-town tableau. "Look at the cars," Rebecca said, pointing toward several vehicles parked along the sidewalks. Ford Pintos, Oldsmobiles, and other models from the late 1970s and early 1980s sat in parking spaces, coated in decades of dust but otherwise appearing as if their owners might return at any moment. There were no shattered windows, no obvious vandalism, just silent watchers waiting for drivers who never came back. I approached the nearest car, a burnt orange Oldsmobile Cutlass. Peering through the window, I saw an interior where everything remained in place. Maps folded in the side pocket, a pack of cigarettes on the dashboard, keys still hanging from the ignition. "Why would people leave their cars?" Victor asked, running his fingers along the hood, leaving trails in the dust. "And their keys?" "That's what we're here to find out," I replied, already moving toward the nearest storefront. The businesses along Main Street included the usual small-town shops, a hardware store, pharmacy, diner, bank, and other local establishments, all looking as though everyone had simply walked away one day. Price tags in the windows displayed outdated prices, and a clothing store had mannequins dressed in early 1980s styles. We split up briefly to explore different stores. I tried the door of the hardware store, which opened with a jingle from a bell above. The interior smelled of dust with faint traces of old metal, oil, and cut wood scent typical of such stores, lingering despite the years. "Guys, you need to see this," Rebecca called from down the street. She stood in the doorway of Miller's Grocery, waving us over. Inside the grocery store, fluorescent light fixtures hung dark above aisles of canned goods, boxed cereals, and household products, all arranged as if awaiting the next day's customers. A layer of dust covered everything, but the shelves looked recently stocked, with no signs of rodents or significant deterioration beyond the passage of time. Rebecca held up a yellowed newspaper, the Melier Gazette, dated July 14, 1984. She carefully unfolded it on the checkout counter, revealing the front page headline, "Unusual Wildlife Movements, Puzzle Local Rangers." We gathered around as she read portions aloud. "Residents report unusual migrations of deer, foxes, and other wildlife away from the Shawnee National Forest region. Park Service unable to explain the sudden exodus. Local hunters describe the woods as unnaturally quiet." "The 14th must have been significant," I said, making mental notes for my journal. "It gets weirder," Dennis said from outside. "Come look at the bank." The First National Bank of Melier stood across the street, its brick walls contrasting with the wooden buildings around it. Above the entrance, an electronic sign alternated between the time and temperature. 6:47 p.m., July 14, 1984, 70 degrees 4. "That can't still be running after all this time," Rebecca said, staring at the glowing red numbers. "The power should have gone out decades ago," I agreed, looking up at the utility poles lining the street. Following the power lines with my gaze, I noticed something odd. "That doesn't make sense," I said. "What?" Victor asked, following my line of sight. "The power lines, they're not running toward the highway or any neighboring towns. They lead into the forest." I pointed to where the lines converged at the edge of town, disappearing among the trees. Victor nodded, then headed toward a squat brick building with a flagpole out front. "I want to check the post office," he said. The others continued examining the bank's exterior while I followed Victor. Inside the post office, rows of brass P.O. boxes lined one wall, and service counters stood ready behind a wooden partition. Victor walked straight to the wall behind the counter, where a large calendar hung. "July 1984, he said quietly, photographing it with his camera. I moved closer to see what had caught his attention. Each day after the 14th had been circled in red marker, not just one or two dates, but every single one through the end of the month. "Like a countdown," Victor whispered, "or a warning." The light outside had dimmed considerably as sunset gave way to dusk. We regrouped on Main Street, sharing our initial findings and planning our next steps. "We should find somewhere to set up for the night," I suggested, checking my watch. "It'll be completely dark soon." As if in response to my words, a soft hum came from above. One by one, the streetlights along Main Street flickered on, bathing the abandoned town in a yellow glow. We froze, staring at what shouldn't have been possible. "That shouldn't be happening," Rebecca said, voicing the obvious. Dennis recovered first, jogging across the street to the diner. We followed him inside, where he headed straight for a light switch on the wall. With a dramatic flourish, he flipped it upward. Overhead, fluorescent fixtures buzzed to life, revealing red vinyl booths and a long counter with chrome-edged stools. A half-written order pad sat by the register, and coffee cups hung from hooks, ready for customers who had vanished nearly 4 decades ago. "The electricity works," Dennis said unnecessarily, flipping the switch off and on again to confirm. Somehow, this entire town still has power. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Dennis toggled the switch once more. None of us spoke for several seconds, trying to process what we were seeing. An abandoned town shouldn't have working electricity after nearly 40 years. "We need to check the rest of the buildings," I said finally. "Split up and cover more ground before it gets completely dark." "Split up?" Rebecca asked, raising an eyebrow. "In the mysterious abandoned town with inexplicable power." "We'll work in pairs," I clarified, glancing at our small group. "Rebecca, you're with me. We'll check the residential areas. Dennis, you and Victor take the school we passed on the way in." Dennis nodded, adjusting his camera strap. "The school might have records. Maybe explain what happened here." "Meet back here in 2 hours," I said, checking my watch. That gives us until sunset. We split up outside the diner, Dennis and Victor heading north, while Rebecca and I walked east toward what looked like a neighborhood. The streetlights glowed every few feet, making the town feel less empty than it should have. "How is this possible?" Rebecca asked quietly as we approached the first house. "The power grid should have failed decades ago without maintenance." "Maybe they had some kind of independent power source," I suggested, though I wasn't convinced by my own explanation. The first house on Maple Street was a single-story ranch with faded blue paint. The front door was unlocked, like everything else we'd encountered in Melier. I pushed it open, wincing at the creak of hinges that hadn't been oiled in decades. Inside, a living room greeted us, with furniture arranged around a vintage television set, a massive wood-paneled box with dials instead of buttons. Photo frames lined the mantel above a brick fireplace. Rebecca moved to examine them while I tested the light switches. They worked, illuminating the room with warm, incandescent light. "This is the Sullivan family," Rebecca said, studying the photos. Based on their clothes and hairstyles, these were taken throughout the late 70s and early 80s. I joined her, looking at pictures of a smiling family mom, dad, and 2 kids, about 10 and 12 years old. They looked normal, happy, a typical American family in a typical American town. We checked each room systematically. The kitchen had dishes in the drying rack and a half-full coffee mug on the counter. The refrigerator hummed softly, which shouldn't have been possible. Rebecca opened it, revealing food in various stages of rot. "This shouldn't exist after 40 years, she muttered, carefully closing it again. She noticed some papers on the refrigerator door, held up with magnets. "Jordan, look at this," she said, pointing to a handwritten note among children's drawings in a grocery list. The note, written in hurried script, read, "Do not go outside after dark. Great danger in town. Keep doors locked, windows covered. Leave town immediately, if possible. They are watching from the trees." "What the hell happened here?" I asked, taking a photo of the note with my phone. "We need to document everything," Rebecca said, already moving to check the remaining rooms. The bedrooms told a similar story of abrupt departure closets full of clothes, personal items on nightstands, beds unmade, as if the occupants had just gotten up. In the children's room, a school backpack sat open, homework half completed on a desk. We checked 3 more houses on the same street, finding similar scenes of interrupted daily life. But it was the photos that began to reveal a pattern. In the 4th house, a 2-story colonial with green shutters, I found a collection of photo albums in the living room bookcase. The earliest was labeled 1000 980, in neat handwriting. "Rebecca, come look at this," I called. She joined me on the couch as I flipped through the albums chronologically. The first showed typical family events, birthdays, holidays, backyard barbecues with everyone smiling naturally at the camera. The 1982 album showed subtle changes. In group photos, several people looked distracted, their attention pulled slightly away from the camera. By 1983, the difference was unmistakable and early. Every photo featured someone looking toward the tree line visible beyond their yard, their expressions marked by furrowed brows, tight lips, and concerned eyes. The final album, labeled 1984, contained the most disturbing images. Family photos showed everyone, even young children, staring fixedly toward the forest edge, their expressions ranging from concern to outright alarm. The last dated photo, from July 10th, depicted the family standing stiffly on their back porch, all facing the woods with identical looks of distress. "They were watching something in the forest," Rebecca said, her voice low. "All of them. And whatever it was scared them. Or drew them in," I added, remembering the power lines we'd seen extending into the trees. We continued our survey of the remaining houses on the block, finding more evidence of hasty departures and similar photographic patterns. In several homes, windows facing the forest had been covered with aluminum foil or blankets nailed to the frames. "Time to meet the others," I said, checking my watch as the shadows lengthened outside. We made our way back to Main Street, both lost in thought about what we'd discovered. Dennis and Victor were already waiting by the diner. Victor perched on a bench while Dennis paced back and forth, reviewing footage on his camera. "Find anything?" I asked as we approached. Dennis looked up, his expression grim. "You could say that." Victor stood, his face paler than usual. "The school was informative. Let's compare notes inside," I suggested, nodding toward the diner. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the abandoned town in deepening shades of amber and red. Once inside, we chose a booth away from the windows. Dennis set his camera on the table while Victor pulled out his journal, opening it to fresh sketches he'd made at the school. "You first," I said to Dennis. "The school looks like everyone walked out in the middle of the day," he began. "Half-eaten lunches in the cafeteria, assignments on the blackboards, attendance records open on the secretary's desk." But Victor found something in the principal's office. Victor slid his open journal across the table. He'd copied a page from what looked like an official log, the handwriting growing messier with each entry. June 12th, 1984. Several students said they saw people at the edge of the woods during recess. Maintenance checked and found nothing. June 20th, 1984. Mrs. Abernathy spotted something moving outside her classroom windows again. They found nothing. July 20, 1984. 3 students didn't come back after the weekend. Parents say they don't know where they are. July 9th, 1984. Weird sounds coming from the woods after dark. 6 more residents gone. July 13th, 1984. They're taking people. God help us. Victor flipped the page to show his sketch of a classroom window, through which he'd drawn a tall, thin shadow standing among the trees. "I found this taped to the back of the log," he said, sliding a black and white photograph across the table. The image showed a school playground with children frozen mid-activity. At the edge of the frame, partially hidden by trees, stood what might have been a person, but proportioned wrong, too tall and thin. "We found warning notes in the houses," Rebecca said, bringing out her phone to show the images she'd captured, and family photos showing everyone growing increasingly fixated on the forest. "Something was watching them from the trees," I summarized, and then people started disappearing. And on July 14th, the day after that final log entry, the entire town vanished. Rebecca finished. The sun was setting, casting deep shadows through the diner windows. None of us had turned on the lights inside, and the growing darkness suddenly felt heavy and uncomfortable. "I don't think we should stay in town tonight," I said, watching the deepening shadows outside. "Let's camp by the vehicles outside the town limits." No one argued. We gathered our equipment quickly and drove the short distance back to where the road entered Melier. About a quarter-mile outside town, we found a suitable clearing with good visibility in all directions. Dennis immediately began setting up his equipment. "I'm putting motion sensors around our perimeter," he explained, placing small devices at regular intervals. "If anything comes near our camp during the night, we'll know." "Smart," I said, helping Rebecca with the tents. Victor sat on a log at the edge of our campsite, his journal open but untouched, his fingers trembling slightly as he stared toward the distant town lights. "You okay?" I asked, approaching him. "Yeah," he said too quickly. "I'll take first watch." I studied him for a moment. Victor looked stressed, his eyes darting toward the tree line every few seconds, but he seemed determined. "All right," I agreed. "Wake Dennis for second watch in 4 hours." Rebecca joined us, her sleeping bag tucked under one arm. "Notice anything?" she asked quietly. I paused, listening. The forest surrounded us completely, yet no sound broke the stillness. No crickets chirped, no owls called, no small creatures rustled in the underbrush. "It's completely silent," Rebecca continued when I didn't respond. The absence of life in the forest was striking. No insects, no birds, nothing at all. Victor pointed out the eerie stillness, noting that even the wind failed to stir the branches of the trees encircling our clearing. Over the years, I had explored countless abandoned place-old buildings, deserted towns, even isolated islands. Each had its own distinct atmosphere, a lingering echo of the people who once inhabited it. But Melier felt different. It wasn't just empty. It felt severed, as if it existed in its own isolated pocket, detached from the rest of the world. As complete darkness fell, we gathered closely around the small fire Dennis had built. The flames illuminated our faces against the backdrop of the still night. I outlined our plan: 4-hour watch rotations, ensuring everyone had their flashlights and emergency whistles ready. "Stay alert," I instructed. "Stay within sight of camp." The unnatural quiet enveloped us as we settled in for the night. Our small campfire, the only source of light in the oppressive darkness of the motionless woods. A biting cold woke me first. The fire had dwindled to embers, casting a faint red glow that barely illuminated the clearing. Blinking in confusion, I checked my watch. Midnight. My shift wasn't for another hour, but something had roused me. Propping myself up on one elbow, I scanned the campsite. Dennis slept nearby, his deep, steady breathing a comforting rhythm. Through the tent flap, I could see Rebecca, her sleeping bag rising and falling with each breath. But Victor's spot was empty. "Victor," I whispered, careful not to wake the others unnecessarily. The unnatural stillness of the forest swallowed my voice, offering no response. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of my sleeping bag, stepping carefully past Dennis. The cold pierced through my clothes as I moved toward the log where Victor had been stationed at the edge of our camp. His journal lay open on the log, but there was no other sign of him. I clicked on my flashlight and swept the beam in a wide arc around our perimeter. Nothing stirred in the darkness. Lowering the light to the ground, I spotted footprints in the soft dirt, leading away from camp toward Melier. I hesitated, weighing whether to wake the others, but Victor couldn't have gone far, and someone needed to stay with our equipment. Deciding to follow the tracks alone, I kept my flashlight focused on the ground. The footprints led in a straight line, showing no signs of hesitation or deviation. Victor had walked with purpose, heading directly back to town. What could have drawn him there in the middle of the night? The town emerged ahead, its streetlights still glowing with that inexplicable electricity. I followed Victor's tracks past the welcome sign and down Main Street, my flashlight beam bouncing across the ground as I walked. The tracks abruptly stopped in the center of the street. Raising my light, I found Victor standing perfectly still, facing the forest edge beyond the last row of buildings. His back was to me, his arms hanging limply at his sides. "Victor," I called softly, approaching him. "What are you doing out here?" He didn't turn or acknowledge me. As I drew closer, I saw his eyes were open, but vacant, fixed on the tree line. His face was expressionless, his mouth slightly open, his breath forming small fog clouds in the cold night air. "Victor," I repeated, touching his shoulder. "It's Jordan. Let's get back to camp." His head turned toward me mechanically, but his eyes remained unfocused, as if staring through me rather than at me. "They're calling from between the trees," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "They want to show us." A shiver ran through me, not from the cold. "Who's calling, Victor?" "There's no one there." Before he could respond, a sound broke the dead silence of the Tona. Strange scraping noise, like massive metal pieces being dragged across pavement. It came from the woods directly ahead, then began moving along the edge of the trees. I aimed my flashlight at the sound, but the beam only penetrated a few feet into the dense forest before darkness swallowed it. The scraping continued, shifting to our right, then behind us, then to the left, as if whatever was making the noise was circling us while staying hidden in the trees. "We need to get back to camp," I said, gripping Victor's arm. He remained unresponsive, his gaze still locked on the forest. The scraping intensified, seeming to come from multiple directions at once, impossible to pinpoint, as if the entire forest had become the source. Footsteps pounded the pavement behind us. I turned to see Dennis and Rebecca running toward us, their flashlights cutting erratic paths through the darkness. "What the hell is that noise?" Dennis asked, breathing heavily as he reached us. The scraping grew louder, as if responding to his question. "I don't know," I answered. "I woke up and found Victor missing. He was just standing here when I found him." Rebecca stepped directly in front of Victor, positioning herself between him and the forest. "Victor," she said firmly, taking his face in her hands. "Victor, look at me." His eyes remained vacant, fixed on some point beyond her. The scraping shifted pitch, rising to a painful whine before dropping to a low, resonant groan that I felt in my chest more than heard. Rebecca shook Victor gently but insistently. "Victor." Something in her voice seemed to reach him. He blinked rapidly, his eyes finally focusing on her face, confusion replacing the blank expression. "Rebecca?" he asked. "What's happening? Why are we in town?" "You tell us," I said. "You walked here in the middle of the night. Don't you remember?" He shook his head, looking around as if seeing our surroundings for the first time. The scraping sound circled closer. "We need to go," Dennis said, his camera forgotten as he kept his flashlight trained on the forest edge. "Now." No one argued. I took Victor's arm and guided him back the way we'd come, following our combined tracks in the dirt. The sound trailed us, maintaining a consistent distance as we hurried back toward camp. "What is that?" Victor asked, his voice stronger now but tinged with fear. "We were hoping you knew," Rebecca replied, keeping pace beside him. The journey back felt twice as long as my initial pursuit of Victor. The scraping noise never ceased, emanating from different spots, but never getting closer or falling behind, perfectly matching our speed. When we reached camp, Dennis immediately began rebuilding the fire, making it larger than before. The bright flames pushed back the darkness, but they did nothing to silence the sound circling us. "What do you remember, Victor?" I asked as we huddled near the fire. He rubbed his face with both hands. "Nothing about walking to town. The last thing I remember is taking first watch, then Dennis relieving me." "I found you standing in the middle of Main Street," I explained. "You were staring at the forest. When I approached, you said, 'They're calling from between the trees.' and they want to show us." Victor's eyes widened. "I said that?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "I remember dreaming. There were figures in the tree stall, thin, watching us." The scraping sound shifted again, taking on a rhythmic quality that almost sounded like speech-metallic mimicry of human voices, too distant to discern words but following the cadence of conversation. "What are they saying?" Rebecca asked, her usual scientific skepticism momentarily abandoned as she stared into the darkness beyond our campfire. "I don't know," Victor answered. "In my dream, they promised to show me what really happened in Melier. They said they were there, they saw everything." We fell silent, listening to the strange noises encircling our camp. None of us dared to investigate further. We added more wood to the fire and took turns keeping watch, two people staying awake at all times, scanning the darkness in every direction. The scraping persisted throughout the night, sometimes fading to a faint murmur, other times growing so loud we couldn't speak over it. It remained at the same distance ever, drawing closer but never fully retreating. The voices continued their unintelligible chatter, sounding almost like words but dissolving into gibberish whenever we tried to focus on them. Morning seemed an eternity away. As the first hints of light filtered through the trees, the sound gradually faded, vanishing with the night. By the time the sun rose, the forest was silent once more, that same unnatural stillness, returning no birds, no insects, no wind. We sat around the dying fire, exhausted, our bloodshot eyes meeting in shared fatigue. "What happened last night?" Dennis finally asked, looking between Victor and me. "I don't know," I admitted. "But whatever it was trying to communicate. The rising sun offered no comfort after our night of eerie sounds. An orange glow spilled between the trees, yet the unnatural silence persisted. No birds heralded the new day. Dennis had fallen asleep during his watch, his camera clutched to his chest like a lifeline. I hadn't found the courage to close my eyes after what we'd experienced. I stood, stretching muscles stiff from hours of tension, my breath visible in the morning chill as I moved toward the tent to check on Victor and Rebecca. "Hey, time to get up," I called, unzipping the entrance flap. The tent was empty. Their sleeping bags lay open, personal items scattered around as if they'd been interrupted mid-sleep. My pulse quickened. I took a deep breath. "Dennis!" I called, keeping my voice steady. "They're gone." Dennis jerked awake, disoriented for a moment before climbing to his feet. "What do you mean, gone? Not in the tent. Not anywhere I can see." He rubbed his eyes and scanned the clearing. "Maybe they went to use the bathroom, both of them, without saying anything?" We called their names, but our voices were swallowed by the thick forest, met only by silence. I found Victor's journal open on his sleeping bag and picked it up, reading his last entry. The handwriting was frantic, scrawled in a rush. "July 17th, 3:47 a.m. They're waiting at the tree line. I must join them. I know what happened now. What will happen? History doesn't repeat. It overlaps. Rebecca understands too." Beneath the writing, he'd filled the page with detailed sketches of tall, emaciated figures with limbs that bent unnaturally. Their heads blank ovals, their bodies mere lines that somehow conveyed a sense of watchful waiting. "Jordan," Dennis called from the edge of camp, his voice tense. "You need to see this." I joined him at the perimeter where he kept his camera equipment. Everything had been dismantled, the pieces arranged on the ground in strange pattern circles, triangles, and spirals that made no sense. "I didn't do this," Dennis said, kneeling beside what had once been his main camera. "Every screw, every circuit board, every lens element separated and arranged. This would take hours, specialized tools and knowledge of exactly how your equipment works," I added, noting how the circuit boards formed the center of the largest spiral. We searched the immediate area, finding Victor and Rebecca's shoes lined up neatly at the edge of Camp 4 pairs pointing toward the forest, like an invitation. They left barefoot, I said, examining the ground. 2 sets of footprints led from the tent into the woods, heading toward Melier. Dennis grabbed his remaining intact camera while I packed my backpack with water and emergency supplies. We followed the tracks through the underbrush, noting their direct, purposeful path, no wandering, no hesitation, just a straight line toward town. About 50 yards in, I stopped abruptly. "The tracks end here," I said, kneeling to examine the forest floor. Both sets of footprints ceased mid-step, as if Victor and Rebecca had vanished while walking. There were no signs of a jump or struggle. The dirt around their last steps was undisturbed. "That's not possible," Dennis whispered, filming the bizarre scene. I stood and surveyed our surroundings, trying to make sense of it. A flash of silver caught my eye, something hanging from a nearby tree branch. "Rebecca's necklace," I said, approaching the pine tree where her vintage compass pendant dangled, swinging gently despite the absence of a breeze. Dennis joined me, his camera focused on the necklace. "She never takes this off. Her grandfather gave it to her." As I reached for it, I noticed markings carved into the tree bark at eye level. The cuts looked fresh, concentric circles, with radiating lines and small triangles forming a perimeter around the center. "It's the same as Victor's drawings," Dennis said, panning his camera between the carving and the open journal I still carried. I checked nearby trees and found more of the same markings, some fresh, others weathered, forming a circle around where the footprints ended. With no other leads, we continued toward Melier, searching for any trace of our friends. The town came into view, bathed in morning sunlight, but it still felt desolate. Main Street looked familiar, yet subtly altered. The burnt orange Oldsmobile Cutlass we'd examined the previous day was no longer parked in front of the hardware store. It now sat crookedly in front of the pharmacy. The displays in the store windows had been rearranged since I last saw them. "Something's different," I said, pausing outside Miller's grocery. Dennis nodded, filming the storefront. "The mannequins in the clothing store, they've changed position." He was right. The day before, they'd stood in a row facing the window. Now they formed a semicircle, all facing the back of the store, as if watching something we couldn't see. We entered the grocery store, finding shelves that had been reorganized overnight. Canned goods now formed perfect pyramids in the center aisle, and the yellowed newspaper Rebecca had shown us was gone from the counter. "New markings," Dennis said, pointing to the wall behind the register. The same symbols from Victor's journal and the forest trees had been drawn across the plaster in what looked like charcoal. Beneath them, a message in unfamiliar handwriting: "Time folds here." We spent the next 6 hours methodically searching Melier, checking every building for signs of Victor and Rebecca. The changes persisted throughout the town: furniture rearranged in houses, vehicles repositioned, new symbols appearing on walls and sidewalks. At the school, every desk and every classroom had been turned to face the windows overlooking the forest. The principal's office, where Victor had found the logbook, was now completely empty. No desk, no chair, no records. "This makes no sense," I said as we exited the school building. "It's like the entire town has been redecorated overnight." Dennis checked his camera battery, which had drained faster than normal despite being fully charged that morning. "We need to consider leaving and getting help." "And tell them what?" I countered. "That our friends vanished in a town that doesn't officially exist. We're the only ones who can find them." The sun hung low by the time we returned to the diner on Main Street, our search yielding nothing but more questions. Dennis set his camera on a table and slumped into a booth. "I'll check the back," I said, pushing through the swinging door into the kitchen. Industrial appliances gleamed in the dim light: stoves, refrigerators, preparation tables. Everything spotless, despite decades of supposed abandonment. On the order counter, a single piece of paper caught my attention. A note in Rebecca's distinctive handwriting. "We're seeing what happened. Don't follow unless they invite you to." I stared at the message, trying to decipher its meaning. The handwriting was unmistakably Hersher characteristic, looping G's and the slight upward flick of her crossed sput, The message itself was cryptic. "Dennis," I called, returning to the dining area with the note. He examined it, comparing it to previous notes Rebecca had made in her research journal. "It's definitely hers," he confirmed. "What does she mean by seeing what happened?" "And who are they?" I added, glancing toward the windows where darkness had begun to gather outside. The street lights flickered on, casting yellow pools of light along the empty sidewalks. "The figures in the forest," Dennis suggested. "The ones that made those sounds last night. The ones Victor drew." I looked at the journal, still open to Victor's last drawings. The elongated faceless figures on the page seemed to gaze at us, their blank faces tilted to the side. "We need to decide what to do," I said, checking my watch. "Keep searching or go for help." Dennis gathered his equipment with a grim expression. "It'll be dark soon. If we're staying, we should set up camp somewhere, defensible or not, back in the forest." I nodded, folding Rebecca's note carefully into my pocket. "The bank. It has fewer windows than most buildings, and only one entrance we'd need to monitor." As we stepped outside, the streetlights clicked on. Main Street looked starkly different at night, its emptiness more pronounced than earlier. The sun had nearly set, and the dark tree line loomed at the edge of town. Light filtered through the bank's heavy front doors when I woke. Dennis sat propped against the teller counter, his camera in his lap, eyes red from keeping watch most of the night. We barricaded ourselves inside the First National Bank of Melier after finding Rebecca's note, taking turns monitoring the single entrance while the other tried to sleep. "Anything?" I asked, my voice hoarse from the dry air. Dennis shook his head. "Not a sound all night. No more scraping noises. No movement outside." I pulled myself up, muscles aching from sleeping on the hard marble floor. The bank's electronic sign continued its impossible loop. 6:47 p.m., July 14, 1984, 72 degrees F. After another hour of searching the bank for clues about Victor and Rebecca, we gathered on the front steps to make a decision. "We can't find them on our own," Dennis said, checking his equipment bag. "We need to get help," I nodded. The morning sun did nothing to dispel the town's emptiness. "We'll leave supplies and maps at camp in case they return, then drive out and contact authorities." By noon, we had packed our remaining gear into Dennis's SUV. I left Victor's journal open on his sleeping bag, with a note explaining our plan to return with help. The camp looked untouched, since morning no footprints, no sign anyone had visited during our absence. "Ready?" Dennis asked, sliding behind the wheel. I took one last look at Melier through the rear window as we pulled away. The town receded into the distance, its neat rows of buildings and impossible electricity growing smaller until trees blocked my view entirely. "This doesn't make sense," Dennis muttered after 15 minutes of driving. I turned my attention to the road ahead and immediately understood his confusion. The path we followed bore little resemblance to the narrow, overgrown track we'd struggled along 3 days earlier. The dirt road had widened considerably, its surface graded and mostly free of the potholes that had challenged Dennis's suspension on the way in. "Are we going the wrong way?" I asked, pulling out Rebecca's maps. Dennis shook his head. "There is no wrong way. There was only one road into town. Yet the evidence contradicted. Memorino fallen tree blocked our path. No abandoned vehicles waited half-hidden by vegetation. The dense forest that had pressed against the road now stood at a respectful distance, creating a wide buffer of open ground on either side. "Try calling for help," I suggested as we reached an actual paved road, one that hadn't existed during our journey in. Dennis pulled over and took out his phone. "Full bars," he said, surprise evident in his voice. He dialed 911 and put the call on speaker. The connection tone sounded normal, but no operator answered. After 30 seconds, the call ended itself. Dennis tried again with the same result, then dialed the local sheriff's department using a number we'd researched before the trip. The phone connected, rang twice, then emitted a high-pitched tone before disconnecting. "Let me try," I said, taking out my own phone. Full signal strength showed on my screen, but calls to emergency services, local authorities, and even my parents all failed to connect. Keep driving, I suggested. Maybe reception will improve further out. As we continued, I noticed movement among the trees to our right. At first, I thought it was a deer keeping pace with our vehicle, but as I looked closer, I realized it was something else entire, a figure walking through the forest matching our speed. It was unnaturally tall, at least 9 feet, with limbs too long and thin to be human. Its body was elongated and slender, swaying slightly with each step. "Dennis," I said quietly, "don't react suddenly, but look to your right through the trees." His eyes flicked to the passenger side mirror, then widened. Without a word, he reached for his camera in the back seat and handed it to me. "Film it," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in his grip on the steering wheel. I turned the camera on and zoomed in on the figure. Through the viewfinder, I saw more details. A smooth, oval head with no Facino eyes, no mouth, just a blank, pale surface. Its arms, impossibly long, nearly touched the ground, swinging rhythmically as it kept pace with our 35 miles per hour speed. "There's another one," Dennis said, nodding toward the left side of the road. He was right. A second figure moved through the trees on the opposite side, matching our speed exactly. As I panned the camera between them, more figures appeared deeper in the forest. 5, then 8, then too many to count easily. They moved in perfect unison, never approaching the road but maintaining their parallel course. "Drive faster," I suggested. Dennis pressed the accelerator, bringing us to 50 miles per hour. The figures accelerated too, their impossibly long legs covering ground with fluid strides that defied human movement. At 70 miles per hour, they still matched us, weaving between trees with unnatural precision. The dashboard clock, which had read 12:17 when we left camp, now displayed 8,874. The GPS screen flickered between locations, showing coordinates that jumped hundreds of miles with each refresh. "Something's wrong with the car," Dennis said as the engine began to sputter. The radio turned itself on, cycling through frequencies before settling on static. Through the white noise, I caught fragments of voices, brief snatches of conversation that might have been Victor or Rebecca, though I couldn't make out the words. Dennis pulled off the highway onto a wider road that the GPS momentarily identified as State Route 13. The figures in the forest vanished as we reached more populated areas. "There should be a gas station up ahead in Marion," Dennis said, consulting a road sign. The Easy Stop gas station appeared rundown but operational. Dennis parked near the pump while I went inside to speak with the attendant, an older man with thinning gray hair and deep creases around his eyes. "Excuse me," I said, approaching the counter. "We're trying to get back to Marion from Melier. Can you point us in the right direction?" The man's bushy eyebrows drew together. "Melier? Ain't no town by that name around here. It's south of here," I explained, "about 40 miles into the Shawnee National Forest. Son, I've lived in this county my whole life. There's never been a town called Melier anywhere in southern Illinois." I kept my expression neutral despite my racing thoughts. "Do you have a local map?" He pulled a folded map from under the counter and spread it across the surface. "Here's Marion," he said, pointing to our location. His finger traced south. "There's Carbondale, Vienna, and down here's the National Forest. No Melier." I studied the map, a growing sense of unease settling in. The exact location where Melier should have been showed nothing but uninterrupted forest. No roads led to the town, not even the one we'd just driven on. "Mind if I buy this?" I asked, reaching for my wallet. "Sure thing." 3. I returned to the SUV where Dennis had finished refueling. "What did he say?" he asked as I climbed in. "He claims Melier doesn't exist. Never has." I unfolded the new map on my lap. "And according to this, he's right. Dennis pulled out his camera. Let's check the footage. We know what we saw. We parked in a corner of the lot and rewound the footage to review. The camera's screen showed the forested road we traveled, but where the figures should have been, there was nothing but trees. The recording broke into static every few seconds, occasionally clearing to show a single frame of symbols identical to those in Victor's journal. This isn't what I filmed, I insisted. I saw them clearly through the viewfinder. Dennis took the camera from my hands, rewinding further to footage from the town itself. The screen displayed only static, no buildings, no streets, no abandoned vehicles. Brief flashes between the noise revealed fragments of forest and symbols carved into trees. Our evidence, Dennis whispered. It's disappearing. I pulled out my phone to check the photos I'd taken in Melier. Each image had corrupted into unrecognizable blocks of pixels, or transformed into close-up shots of forest ground with no context. We sat in silence, the implications sinking in. Finally, Dennis started the engine. We're going back, he said. I nodded, knowing we had no other choice. We couldn't leave Victor and Rebecca in a place that apparently didn't exist. As we merged back onto the highway heading south, I noticed Dennis checking his rearview mirror more frequently than necessary. What is it? I asked. Nothing, he said too quickly. Just making sure we're on the right road. But I knew he was looking for something else. Those tall, skinny figures that had followed us out. I turned to check the back window and saw something move far behind us on the highway of figures standing in the middle of the road, far too tall and thin to be human. 3 days passed in a blur after our failed attempt to leave Melier. We had turned back, searching for Victor and Rebecca for another full day before finally accepting we couldn't find them without help. The return journey to Chicago remained largely unspoken between Dennis and me. Neither of us comfortable discussing the tall figures that had lined our path out of the forest, visible in flashes between the trees, but vanishing whenever we slowed or stopped. I sat at Dennis's cluttered dining table in his Chicago apartment, surrounded by camera equipment, laptops, and printouts of our dwindling evidence. Outside, rain tapped against the windows as evening settled over the city. The normalcy of traffic sounds and distant sirens felt surreal after the unnatural silence of Melier. I found something, Dennis said, his voice hoarse from hours of analyzing footage. He hadn't slept much since our return, dark circles shadowing his eyes as he turned his laptop toward me. On the screen played footage from our first day in Melier, initial walk down Main Street. Watch the pharmacy window as we pass, he instructed, pointing to the upper corner of the frame. I leaned forward, squinting at the image. As our past selves walked down the sidewalk, something moved behind the glass, a long, skinny shape that seemed to follow us, just like the figures we'd seen in the forest. Tall and thin with that featureless oval head. I never saw that when we were there, I said. Dennis nodded grimly. They're in most of the footage watch. He cycled through clips. The hardware store showed a figure standing motionless in the back room. The diner revealed one reflected in the chrome countertop. The school hallway captured part of a figure disappearing around a corner. They'd been there the entire time we were exploring, watching us while staying just out of plain sight. There's more, Dennis said, opening another file. This is from our first night at camp. The night vision footage showed our tents from several yards away. Time-stamped 2:17 a.m. Victor emerged from his tent, eyes open but vacant, and walked to the edge of camp, standing facing the forest for nearly 10 minutes before returning to his sleeping bag. This happened every night, Dennis continued, showing similar clips from our subsequent evenings. Always around the same time, always the same behavior. The night he disappeared, the camera caught this. The final clip showed Victor rising at 2:14 a.m. This time, Rebecca stirred and followed him. They stood at the forest edge, Victor in his trance-like state, while Rebecca appeared fully awake. She whispered something toward the trees, though the audio didn't capture her words. After several minutes, they returned to the tent. Then, at 3:47, they both left. That's when I fell asleep during my watch, Dennis said, his voice tight with guilt. The camera caught their departure. He played the last clip. Victor and Rebecca exited the tent together, walking purposefully toward the tree line. As they reached the edge of the camera's view, several tall figures stepped partially into frame, their elongated limbs moving with the same fluid grace we'd witnessed during our escape attempt. Rebecca reached toward them, and the footage dissolved into static. "I've tried everything to recover what happens next," Dennis said. "Nothing works." I pushed away from the table, needing space to process what I'd seen. The apartment suddenly felt too small, too confined. My coat still hung by the door where I'd dropped it upon arrival, expedition notes spilling from the pockets. "What about the historical research?" I asked, gathering the scattered papers. Dennis gestured to his bulletin board, where he'd printed newspaper articles, maps, and public records covering southern Illinois from 1980 to 1985. Red string connected related items in a web of associations. "No official record of a town called Melier ever existing in Illinois," he explained. "No incorporation documents, census data, nothing. But I found these." He handed me photocopies of newspaper clippings from regional papers dated summer 1984. Headlines stood out: "Unexplained Departures Puzzle Authorities," and "Southern Illinois Communities Report Missing Residents." The articles described multiple small towns in the Shawnee National Forest region experiencing unusual population declines over a 3-month period. Local authorities attributed the departures to economic factors, but witnesses reported neighbors leaving without taking possessions or notifying anyone. One article quoted a forest ranger: "It's like they just walked into the woods and never came back. No vehicles missing, no packing up houses, just gone." I spread the articles across the table, connecting events across the timeline. "So, Melier wasn't the only place this happened, and maybe it was removed from records afterward, expunged completely," Dennis added. He returned to his computer, opening an audio analysis program. I isolated the scraping sounds from that night at camp. Listen to this. The same metallic scraping we'd heard filled the apartment, that harsh, grinding noise that had surrounded us in the forest. Dennis adjusted some settings, playing the sound in reverse at reduced speed. Through the distortion, a voice emerged. Victor's voice, strained and altered. "They exist between moments," Victor's voice said through layers of electronic manipulation. "They collect those who see them. The town is bait. The town is always waiting." My stomach tightened hearing his voice. "When did he record this? We never heard him say these things." "He didn't," Dennis said. "Not to us. But somehow his voice is embedded in those sounds. And there's more. Rebecca, too." He played another segment. Rebecca's voice, distant but recognizable, came through. "There are gaps in time where they live, moments between seconds. They've been watching us since we arrived." As Dennis worked to extract more audio, his equipment began malfunctioning. The screen flickered and the audio playback distorted. The image on his monitor fragmented, pixels rearranging into patterns I recognized from Victor's journal, concentric circles with radiating lines. "What's happening?" I asked, moving closer. "I don't know. Everything's corrupting." Dennis typed frantically, trying to save files as they degraded before our eyes. On the second laptop, photo files from our trip began disappearing from their folders, thumbnail images blinking out one by one. Video clips rendered into static, then transformed into brief flashes of symbols before vanishing completely. The map on Dennis's wall changed as we watched the marker indicating Melier's location shifted several miles east, landing in empty forest according to the topographic overlay, then moved again and again, as if the town itself was migrating across the landscape. "We're losing everything," Dennis said, his voice breaking as he fought to preserve what little evidence remained. My phone buzzed on the table. When I looked at the screen, there wasn't a notification instead. A text document had opened on its own, words appearing letter by letter as if someone else was typing remotely. They notice when you notice them. They take what knows them. The text vanished before I could show Dennis. My photo gallery opened on its own, scrolling through my pictures from Melier, which turned into corrupted blocks of color before deleting themselves. Dennis's speakers crackled with one last piece of audio, Rebecca's voice, clear and calm despite everything. They've always been here. We just weren't supposed to notice. The electronics in the apartment died simultaneously. Laptops, phones, cameras, everything went black. The power remained on, but every device connected to our investigation had shut down. We sat in stunned silence for several minutes. When the equipment eventually rebooted, every file related to Melier had vanished. The map on the wall showed intact forest where we knew a town had stood. Victor's journal pages, which I'd photographed before leaving his journal behind, now showed nothing but blank paper. Dennis broke the silence first. Do you understand what happened to them now? I nodded slowly, the truth settling into me with cold certainty. Victor and Rebecca hadn't been taken against their will. They'd seen something we missed, understood something we couldn't grasp. They'd gone willingly into whatever existed in the gaps between normal perception. They're still in Melier, I said, but maybe they're experiencing it as it actually was not abandoned. But at the moment, everything changed. July 14th, 1984, Dennis whispered, recalling the date on the bank sign. Outside, rain continued falling on a city that had never heard of Melier. Inside, we sat surrounded by the hollow space where our evidence had been, trying to decide if we should attempt to forget what we'd seen or return to the forest to find our friends. The decision, I suspected, had already been made for us. The tall figures had let us leave because we hadn't truly seen them, not the way Victor and Rebecca had. But now we knew to look for them, hiding in reflections, standing in doorways, watching from between trees. They notice when you notice them, I realized with quiet certainty. We would return to Melier immediately, not recklessly, but eventually. The compulsion would grow until we had no choice. The town that didn't exist would call us back, just as it had called Victor and Rebecca into the forest. When Dennis looked up from his empty computer screen, I saw in his eyes that he understood this, too.